That's one of my favorite clips of all time because it screams Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Now, this movie clip is a good metaphor for us as Christians. So let's think about this for a minute. We are given a task in life. In this case, Brock, the main character, is asked to do a death crawl and give his very best effort. He asks the coach if making it to the 30-yard line is good enough, but the coach says, no, you get to the 50. Brock doesn't believe he can make it that far, but the coach is trying to push him to the very brink of his abilities. So Brock gets ready to go. The coach puts a blindfold on him so he wouldn't give up when he got to a certain point. And as he starts out, he carries his burdens on his back. Now, the character's name is Jeremy, but that's a representation of all of his pain, his doubts, his fears, all that stuff that's weighing him down. Brock gets off to a strong start. His muscles were just starting to get warmed up. After a few yards, he stops. Now, sometimes, I think in our own lives, we just want to stop and give up because life just seems too hard. And things are just too hard to handle. But Coach is in his ear, telling him to keep moving. So Brock gets going again. And as he gets going again, he starts to notice that his muscles are starting to burn. It hurts, Coach! It burns! The coach starts getting more intense in his ear. He says, I know it hurts. Keep moving. Don't stop. Life gets to us sometimes. Pain becomes overwhelming. Our strength fails. Don't stop. Keep moving. You're doing great. But it hurts, Coach. Come on, just a little further. You're almost there. But the enemy wants to keep us from achieving our goal. You've got cancer. You're deep in debt. You're addicted to something. You're overwhelmed at work. Whatever it is, it seems like there's always roadblocks in our way. And even as we start to concentrate on those things, we can still hear Coach right in our ear. Come on, Brock, 30 more steps. But it hurts. Come on, 20 more steps. Coach, I don't have any more. I'm done. No, you've got more, and I know it. 10 more steps. I can't. 3 more steps. 1 more step. Ugh. That's got to be the 50, Coach. Did I make it to the 50? And in the best moment on that clip, the coach takes off the blindfold and says to Brock, he says, look up, Brock. You're in the end zone. And with his face dripping in sweat, Brock looks up and he realizes that he's done much more than he ever expected that he could do. He thought he could do 30 yards, but Coach pushed him to 100 yards when 50 seemed impossible. He pushed through the pain and the burning of his muscles to accomplish a task that not only would change him, but his team. Now, if you notice at the beginning of the clip, Brock's teammates were all sitting there, and they were laughing at the goal that the coach had laid out. They're thinking in their heads, he can't do that. He can't make it to the 50, and he's going to certainly fail. But as the clip ends, every single one of his teammates and coaches are standing in amazement at what they had just witnessed. Coach tells Brock that he's been equipped by God to accomplish the tasks that are asked of him. If he walks around defeated, then other players on the team will too. But if he accepts the challenge, then God will be right by his side, giving him the strength that he needs to accomplish the task. And he'll be able to do much more than he ever thought possible because he's no longer relying on his own strength, but on the supernatural strength of God. So I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit different this morning. I'm going to ask you to get your Bibles out. And if you don't have one, get one of the red ones there in your pew. And I'm going to ask you to turn to Philippians 4. If you're using one of the red Bibles, it's on page 1071. I'll help you cheat. If you've got your own Bibles, you might want to highlight this. In verse 13, it says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Those words were written by Paul, but he had much more to say on the subject than meets the eye. I want you to look back at verse 12. Immediately preceding this verse, here's what Paul says. He says, I have learned the secret to being content in every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Now let's think about what that means for a second. Paul was certainly a man who knew both sides of having plenty and having nothing. He started life out as a powerful Jewish ruler with a silver spoon in his mouth. He could do whatever he wanted, almost. As he converted to being a Christian, he faced many hardships, including prison, going hungry, being abandoned by friends, shipwreck, beatings, people trying to murder him, and more. Yet in the midst of all this, he was able to figure out how to be content no matter what happened to him. He learned the secret that most of us are going to struggle all our lives to find. So what does Paul mean by being content? It's an inner sense of rest or peace that comes from being right with God and knowing that He's in control of everything that happens to us. The secret to having this peace is understanding that no matter what we go through, there is a purpose and a reason for it. When Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians, he was in prison. Yet he knew that there was a purpose for him being there. So there are some consequences to understanding God's purposes for our lives. And some of them you might not like, including this first one. The first thing to realize is that God does not exist to bring us happiness. Wait, what did he just say? I'll say it again. God does not exist to bring us happiness. As Americans, we believe that the pursuit of happiness is a fundamental right of every human being. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that we will live happy lives as Christians. In fact, if you look through the Bible at the lives of the great heroes of faith, I would venture to say that many of them were not very happy at all. Moses dealt with a ruthless Pharaoh. And then when that was done, he dealt with a people that doubted him and complained every step of the way. Joshua lived in a state of constant war as he tried to conquer the promised land. All of the prophets had leaders and people opposed to their messages from God. Paul went through a ton of adversity in his life, and I could go on and on and on. But I would venture to say that happiness was not a hallmark of God's followers in this life. What is painfully obvious is that suffering is the lot of most of the heroes of the Bible, and we should expect it as part of our own Christian journey as well. But when we face suffering of any kind, we can still be content because we know that there's a reason and a purpose for what we're going through. Many times, God is trying to teach us something so that we can serve Him. Other times, He may be trying to get us to change our behavior. Still other times, He may have a reason that's beyond our comprehension, but that serves a greater purpose for the kingdom of God. But just like Paul, we need to learn that God is in command. But it hurts, coach. I know it does, but keep going. You're doing great, and I know that you're capable of more. Don't stop. So our understanding of God needs to change. He doesn't exist to make us happy or successful or powerful in terms of the world's standards. No, in fact, it's the opposite. We exist to bring God glory. That's why we're here. When we accept that God has a purpose for all that we go through, we can see how our life and our actions bring God glory. And when we're fulfilling our role in God's plan, we have an eternal sense of joy that cannot be broken by the world. Happiness is shallow, but joy is a feeling that flows from our heart because we know that God is glorified by who we are and our actions that serve His plans. And there's a second consequence of understanding God's purposes for our lives. We cannot serve God unless we are humble. The first response of most humans when they face adversity is to rely on our own strength. Many of us think that no matter what we face, we can conquer the problem using the resources that we've built for ourselves. As Americans, we're taught that to get ahead, we have to be as strong as we can be, as smart as we can be, as beautiful as we can be, and the world will give us what we want. We need to be self-sufficient, trying not to be a burden on anyone, right? The more money we have, the more things we have, and the more power we have are all signs that we are successful. But again, that's not what the Bible tells us. We all have weaknesses and flaws. No matter how much we try to bury them or hide them, we all have weaknesses. Paul was readily open about his weaknesses and even said that he boasts about them. Paul brags about his weaknesses. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about a vision that he had. He had seen heaven, and it was such a great vision that he couldn't describe what he had seen. This vision had affected him so much that it caused him to think about how small he really was. It seemed to him that there was no point in boasting about how great he was, but instead, he boasted about how great God was, because whatever was good in him was outshone by the blinding light of God at work in him. The source of anything good about Paul was God himself. So Paul talks about his weaknesses, and he learns a great truth. He asked Christ to remove the things that caused him to be weak, but the reply was not at all what he was expecting. Jesus answered him and said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Now here's what that means. Our weaknesses drive us to our knees in humility to ask God for his help. We can't do anything about our weaknesses. If we could, they would no longer be weaknesses. But when we seek out God's help for those things that we can't overcome, we are supplied with the power of God. It's perfected because we have nothing holding us back. No pride, no ego, nothing stopping us from completely depending on Christ for his strength to fill us up. So let me give you an example of how this works. And he's standing right in front of you. Every time I give a sermon or teach a youth group or a Sunday school lesson, or I have to stand and talk in front of any group of people, I have to admit that I am terrified. I am an introvert, which means that I'm naturally shy and I'm intimidated by crowds of people. It's a weakness of mine that I get nervous with all the stomach, the butterflies, and all that kind of stuff before a sermon. But what do? I pray fervently and I pray humbly that God would fill me up with his strength, with his words to speak, and his power to overcome all of my flaws, weaknesses, and nervousness. So when the sermon's over and I'm standing out there in the narthex, shaking people's hands, and someone says, "Hey, good job today," or "That was a good sermon," all I hear is "To God be the glory." Because it's from him that this comes. And it's the same thing with suffering. We are driven back to God to completely depend upon him for our strength. And his strength is much more powerful, much more efficient, much more sustaining, and much more life-changing than our own strength. When we depend on him, we are able to do so much more than we could ever do on our own, because the source of his strength is limitless. Our own strength is limited in so many ways because of our doubt, the scope of our thoughts, and our small point of view. But God sees everything and knows exactly what we need to accomplish our goals. Times of suffering can be our greatest times of growth because it's our reliance on God that fuels our growth spiritually. He is the coach yelling in our ear, "Don't give up. Keep moving. Keep moving. Don't stop now. You're almost there." So the secret to being content in this life is to know that God is at work behind the scenes and has a purpose for everything that we go through. The purpose for everything that happens to us is to bring him glory. We may not understand the whys and the hows, but we can rest and be at peace, understanding that God knows what he's doing and ultimately will work his plan to perfection. Our role is simply to accept our place in his plan and to give everything our best. And someday, I hope that Coach will remove the blindfold from my eyes and say, "Look up, Don.